Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to this season 12 episode of Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined today by Professor Habiba Ibrahim, Associate Professor of English at the University of Washington. She's the author of Troubling the Family, The Promise of Personhood and the Rise of Multiculturalism, published in 2012 by the University of Minnesota Press, and the just published Black Age, Oceanic Lifespans and the Time of Black Life. She is my label mate, so this was published by New York University Press this year, 2021. Of Black Age, Margot Natalie Crawford, the author of Black Post-Blackness, writes, "This truly revelatory book uncovers the flesh of Black Age. Through a focus on Black untimeliness, Habiba Ibrahim reveals a counter-history of modernity. Ibrahim adds new vital dimensions to the study of Blackness as an alternative relation in time. This tremendous book reveals that Black life is a state of being alienated from the time of one's own body and a radical refusal of patriarchal adulthood." How are you doing today, Professor Ibrahim?
I'm doing well. How are you, Mark? Thank you for having me.
I'm doing well. Let me just say, wow. There is a lot here. This is an amazing contribution to the field. So we'll start with congratulations. And if you could take us on a journey from Troubling the Family to Black Age. How do we get to this moment of you talking about oceanic lifespans and what you call Black Age?
Yes, thank you for that. It's, it was an unexpected journey, right? Because my first book deals with the cultural politics of multiracialism, and I end with the Obama administration, which is just beginning. And that book, my first book, ends with his victory speech in 2008 when he evokes the story of Ann Dixon Cooper.
Ann Dixon Cooper is 106 years old. She was born just a generation past slavery, a time when there were no cars on the road or planes in the sky, when someone like her couldn't vote for two reasons: because she was a woman and because of the color of her skin. And tonight, I think about all that she's seen throughout her century in America.
And he goes into this, this narrative about how she had seen all sorts of violence and, sorts of developments of the early 20th century. And through this long life that she leads, the culmination of her freedom is her ability to cast a vote for the first Black president, right? And so in that sense, he uses the story to shore up the symbolic power that elderly Black women have to be the conveyors of history in order to announce something about his own unprecedentedness, right? His own historic victory, and in some ways, his own status as a race man, right? So in a sense, his own achievements as a Black masculine figure relies on the symbolic power of very elderly Black womanhood. And so, I ended that book kind of sitting with that particular symbolic power of elderly Black womanhood. Why is it that elderly Black women, kind of are presumed to have this sort of, power of historical conveyance, or to be a mediating presence between the past and the present, right? What is this kind of temporal labor that elderly Black women play? And so in other moments during the Obama administration, particularly during, I think it was the 2013 State of the Union address, where he kind of gives a very similar story, this time with Desaline Victor.
When Desaline arrived at her polling place, she was told the wait to vote might be 6 hours. And as time ticked by, her concern was not with her tired body or aching feet, but whether folks like her would get to have their say. And hour after hour, a throng of people stayed in line to support her.
Who, again, very elderly, also involved in, electoral politics, right? She's waiting online for hours and hours, and the culmination of the struggle is the capacity to cast a vote for the first Black president, right? And so, in a sense, it just seemed like, it was sitting with me, this question of how the Obama administration in particular was, sort of utilizing the iconicity of elderly Black womanhood. But then in 2014, or 2012, I should say, like right around that time where Obama is still sort of announcing a kind of post-racial era, in that same moment, 2012, we have the murdering death of Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old boy, right? And so it seemed like in that moment where we kind of still have the kind of, presumption of a post-racial era, we also have the very stark reminder that even the most innocent among us, even the most, deserving of protection can be killed in the streets, led to a kind of inflection point, right? It seemed that we were at the end of an era and the beginning of another. And what made that inflection point conspicuous to me was the contradiction of the two moments, but also the way the contradiction sort of announced itself through age. So while the Obama administration can very much trade in these sort of symbolic gestures that signify something about the culmination of something, the ending of something, the arrival of something, right? The arrival of full personhood, the arrival of full citizenship, the arrival of full humanity. The contradiction was marked by how that was paired with this sense that we haven't arrived, right, at all in many ways. And so the question that came up, right, was no longer, are we post-racial? It was, are Black children children? Do Black children have a childhood, right? And so that question was really the seedbed for Black Age. It was a question that sort of made me wonder whether or not Black people in general have a claim to normative social meanings of age. If Black children are not granted a childhood, then how did that happen? Right. From whence does that problem arise? What does it mean to think of that alongside of the kind of iconicity of Black elderliness, right? As always being available to serve up a kind of, promise, right? Or a kind of version of the past. So that's really where the book really kind of, took hold for me.
This is a book that really disrupts our sense of time. And if for a moment you can talk and distinguish a bit from what you describe and think of as Black age from what we might also think of as Black time.
Right. Good question. Excellent. Thank you so much for asking it and, bringing me straight into, a kind of critical point in the book, because I think of the two as being very, very closely related to the point where one might, in fact, wonder if there is a distinction. Age, I think of as kind of embodied time, right? It's the time that we experience as the passing of years, right? We think of age as years lived. We think of age as sort of developmental benchmarks. So we feel time moving by virtue of the way we understand our age. And, to that end, I think that there's something embodied about time that age is signifying. But when it comes to Black time and a kind of untimeliness, which is something I open up in the book as a kind of analytical term, I'm interested in the way that Blackness as a social category had been formed through particular modes of modern violence, Western modern violence. So, when we think about how, for instance, Black gender becomes something of a non-normative category, I draw very deeply and heavily from Hortense Spiller's 1987 essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, right? The essay that keeps on giving. And, in that context, right, we can think of the transatlantic slave trade as that, sort of really, crucial moment in which the violence of racial capitalism, the violence of the slave ship itself, right, the ways in which human beings are transformed into cargo, produce a set of conditions that lead to an ungendering, an unmaking, right? And so I think of age as being similarly unmade, that there's something that occurs at the, through the processes of enslavement and transatlantic enslavement that is very much connected to gender, right? When you transform human beings into cargo and pack them onto ships as commodities, you're no longer thinking about what age means in a social sense. You're thinking about, taxes, you're thinking about quantities, right? You're thinking about, the political economy of the Western modern world. You're not thinking about the social human meaning of age. And so I think of age as being undone in that sense. And that undoing, I think, brings us to, at least that undoing becomes a vector for an alternative way of thinking about Western modernity. If we can think about Western modernity through time, it's the normative time of rights. It's the normative time of, being a citizen, right? Once you turn a certain age, you have particular obligations and, privileges, but you also, have, in a sense, a kind of unequal, right, schedule of rights. You can think about age in developmental terms, right? That there's this idea of being, able to reach a sort of, developmental pinnacle, which becomes the ultimate version of human capacity, right? And of course, that's unequal. We can think about age in terms of philosophical development, in terms of biological development. And so when I think of time in these varying ways that have shored up a particular version of Western man. Untimeliness is the underbelly of that. It's the undoing of time through Western modern violence that then leads to an alternative experience of modernity itself.
You opened the book talking about, the most well-known case of violence against a Black male body, Emmett Till. And, you compare conversations about Black childhood to this idea that, when we think about children, it's like all of their face. And how his mother, Mamie Mobley Till, undoes that notion of childhood by forcing us to have to confront the facelessness of her son. Talk a little bit about that moment.
Yeah, because it became so much a part of the present after Trayvon Martin's, murder, right? We were in 2012, and then we were also back in 1955. And in a sense, the hoodie that Trayvon wore as a kind of way of, the way that had been taken up as a kind of icon of, either, him being something of like a criminal element, right? Something other than a human being, right? The way it obscures, right? That was part of a kind of violent narrative about his death. But then the facelessness of Emmett Till, which is, the outcome of racial violence, becomes, what I think of as perhaps, an icon of the flesh, right? Which in a sense is something that, in Hortense Spiller's essay is produced. The flesh is that which is produced through the technologies of Western modern racialized violence. And by virtue of having been produced through those conditions, it becomes that which carries with it the capacity for thinking of an alternative way of being and knowing that is outside of the dominant ways we think of being human. And so I wanted to think of, Emmett Till in the casket, faceless, when his mother is displaying this, we all know, right, that she's attempting to display to the world what happened to her son. But I also think of that as a moment where she's also inviting us to be a part of what it means to be, not just her child and a child, but to be part of a subjective experience where, regardless of your age, there's no protection for you, right? Regardless of your gender, there's no protection for you. Regardless of where you happen to be when you are racialized as Black, there's no protection for you. And so I kind of see the flesh not as signifying normative childhood, like the innocence of childhood, which is what the face often signifies, but signifying a kind of fleshy connection to other subjects. And, as such, it's a kind of allurement, right? It's kind of her inviting him to be a part of the protest, right? Like, we are in this, right? We are here. We are implicated in the flesh. And so I kind of, wanted to kind of explore what that, absence, but also the presence of flesh might have meant in terms of, just an alternative way of thinking about our liberation.
You mentioned Hortense Spillers earlier as one of your interlocutors, and she is, in terms of an influence on the book, when you talk about this idea of the ungendering of Black bodies during the Middle Passage, right? It also allows you to talk about the significance of the Atlantic Ocean and what you call in the title of the book, Oceanic Lifespan. So talk about that particular piece of the puzzle as you're thinking about Black age.
Yeah, the Oceanic is certainly a site that, in Black studies, when we think about, the kind of originating forces for modern Blackness, we think of the ocean, right? We think of the Transatlantic, we think of the Atlantic Ocean, transatlantic slavery, I should say, but we think of the Atlantic Ocean specifically. And, I kind of wanted to signify that the, transatlantic slave trade and thus the Atlantic Ocean is still, Michelle Wright's work does a wonderful job to trouble the epistemology of the Middle Passage as the originating source of modern Blackness. And I take that, I take that seriously. But I kind of want to start there because I think what Spillers does by, drawing us to that particular location is really generative. And I wanted to kind of, open up what's implicated in what she does when she says that those bodies in transport were in the nowhere, right, of the Atlantic, which is to say, not only had they been removed from a social context in which their humanity made sense, but they're now entering a whole other, regime, right, in which we might be able to think about at once all of the discourses that have to do with being human. And so I kind of think of the Oceanic as this kind of, it's a historical site, it's a geopolitical site, but I think of it also as a kind of philosophical site where we really can tease apart all of the narratives, all of the presumptions that have led to the way we think about who can be human and who can't be human. And so that's kind of why I wanted to, sort of start there and sort of, name what happens there, right? Oceanic Lifespans to me is a way of thinking about, age as that which takes into account the constant struggle between those, sort of forces that can either, produce a sort of logic about our being and knowing, and those who are subjected to it, right? There's a constant dialectical struggle that's occurring at the site of age. And I think that the Atlantic is one way to tease apart the parts of it, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say in the way that Spillers uses Freud to, not only, take what he does and turn it on its head, but she's taking Freud and the way he refers to the oceanic feeling, right? That feeling of being non-differentiated, right? We're all, and he's thinking about it in terms of religion and those who are, have a very strong sense of religiosity. And he's thinking about that kind of oceanic feeling as being a kind of regressive experience, right? Because it defies the adult developed ego, to feel non-differentiated in the way that one might feel when one feels connected to God or to others is, for Freud, kind of this unusual infantilization that occurs in the healthy ego of the adult. And so in that sense, to be undifferentiated for Freud is a kind of problem for this fulfillment of what I call, patriarchal adulthood, right? The ultimate version, not only of being an adult, but of being human, right?
Yeah.
So to be like infantilized in that way is not only to be in a problematic position with regard to being able to reach full adulthood, but there's also something racialized about that, right? Because we know that in racialist discourses, when it comes to how racialization is thought of in terms of value, infantilization, that underdevelopment, that lack of development is very much a racializing, concept, right?
Yeah.
So to be non-differentiated in the oceanic, to never be able to, achieve a kind of adulthood, right, which comes with a healthy differentiated ego, and to think of that as racialized, right? And then, to think of that in terms of racial capitalism, which separates us, right? So in a sense, there's a contradiction that's happening at the site of the oceanic, which, I wanted to draw out of Spillers. Like, I feel as if the implications of what she's doing, we've mined that essay to death, right? But in a sense, there's something that we haven't really explored with regard to what development means in terms of being undone, right? And so, when it comes to the fact that you're on a slave ship, right, that you've been transformed into cargo, that you are in transport to a world where you will be a fungible commodity, that is the result of racial capitalism, right? So it's the separation between humans or groups of humans from other groups of humans, so that what becomes difficult or impossible to do is think about our shared values or our shared value, right? Our shared human capacities, our shared solidarity projects, right? Our shared ways of being in the world, our shared ways of knowing. It prevents a kind of, sharing and a kind of being with that becomes its own sort of violence. And so I kind of wanted to think about the oceanic and these terms of development in terms of, both this kind of the terms of being a full human and what differentiation means for that, but also how differentiation is also a violent condition that separates us, right? So that's where the oceanic, I think, does a lot of conceptual work for me.
I want to shift a moment to talk a little bit about Claudette Colvin, who ironically has been in the news recently. But even before directly talking about her, you talk about this interesting dynamic of Black untimeliness and its relationship to the time of the nation, which in many ways draws, as you describe it, kind of late 20th century Black literary theory or literary studies, into notions of temporality and slavery as a way in which the Black subject is now in time and in line with the time of the nation. And hence your term, Black untimeliness, and the way that you actually bring us into focus in this. And I chuckled because you used the term entanglement, which comes up a few times in the book, which of course, makes me think of Will Smith and and, and that whole conversation about entanglement. But it's really Black masculinity and the story of Black masculinity that's used to address, bringing together the Blackness, the Black subject, and the time of the nation, and how, in a comparison to looking at Emmett Till with Claudette Colvin, right, we can recover Emmett Till, but we don't recover Claudette Colvin, right? And the way that you describe it, that the way that, Black studies more broadly and Black literary studies, in particular, becomes a project of disavowing those subjects that are deemed out of time, right? And I'm thinking about out of time in two ways, right? They're out of time with the timeliness of the nation, right? But they're literally figures who were out of time, right? To be able to articulate more about their own lives and their own situations in the moment that it happens, right? So they become forgotten figures, in that sense, right? Because they don't follow along the timeline in the same way that an Emmett Till or somebody else does, right? So for a moment, if you could talk about that notion of the disavowal of Black subjects that are deemed out of time.
Thank you for that. I think that that's absolutely, yes. I mean, it's all over the book, but it's all over everything we can think of when it comes to what it means to be in time in a kind of heteropatriarchal sense of nationalist time, right? And so in a sense, it goes back to the beginning, right? Obama's in time, right?
Right.
But he needs an untimely subject to kind of signify that in some way,
right?
Right? And so in some ways he did his own recovery, right? Like, would we have known of an Ann Dixon Cooper without him sort of using her for that symbolic purpose of shoring up his own masculine timeliness, right? His own ability to stand for the nation. I think that you're right with regard to I mean, in a sense, Claudette Colvin in relation to Emmett Till are interesting insofar as Emmett Till, is recoverable under particular conditions, right? I mean, of course, his death was shocking at the time it happened, but he could be recovered as somebody's son, right? He could be recovered as someone who we, right? And when I say we, I'm speaking of those of us who still kind of have a particular purchase to the historical narrative, right? That was a moment where someone who should have been protected, right, by virtue of his youth, right? He was 14 years old, by virtue of the fact that, we know now, right, that whatever was the provocation for his murder was specious, right? There was never a justification for it, right? And so we have this idea, this way of attaching fairly normative notions of what innocence is to, Emmett Till, right? The fact that he belongs to a family, right? The fact that he's a child in the family, the fact that we know who his mother is, right? The fact that he did nothing wrong, right? The fact, right? And then all of the circumstances around it, right? He was visiting family in Money, Mississippi, right? He was with other children. There's something about the way we have to attach, normative aspects of the story in order for the story to live, right? So if Emmett Till, if it wasn't, Mamie Till Mobley who brings him up to the top of our consciousness and thus enshrines him in history, right? If his family formation looked like something else, right? If he didn't have a family, would we know him, right? If he was someone who wasn't, connected to a community we can understand, would we know him, right? So in a sense, there's this way in which timeliness requires a kind of capitulation to particular norms that come out of particular institutions, right? Some of them are patriarchal, et cetera. When it came to, Claudette Colvin's story, she attempts to wage her own protest, on a bus, right? We know that Rosa Parks does this, and we know that Rosa Parks does it heroically, and she's, lionized for it as a result. But we also know that, maybe, Rosa Parks was a more, respectable figure for protest, right? I mean, in some ways, her deservedness is unimpeachable, right? She is often coded as being elderly, right? She actually isn't as old as she, sometimes is imagined as being, but nonetheless, right? She, is lighter skinned, right? She's, very sort of middle class presenting. And when she stages a quiet protest, we are meant to kind of remember that this is a proper bourgeois subject for all intents and purposes, who was not deserving of the indignities that come with, crossing the sort of line of what's, sort of legislated as being, legal, right? And so Claudette Colvin, a teenager, she was presumed to be pregnant, in a sense that's already this question of like her youth, plus this question of impropriety, right? Sexually, like, is she kind of, how is she deserving of our protection, right? How is she deserving of our, in a sense, right, our own investment in her capacity to express herself, right? Like, what would it mean to kind of remember the subject in a context, right? What would be the context for remembering her if it's not one that's already shrouded with the trappings of respectability and the trappings of heteropatriarchal sort of supremacy, right? Like, so in a sense, who we remember and who we don't remember. And this is, I have to say, like, it's all come up to the fore in the last several years, in the last decade, with regard to, the call to say her name, right? That was a very, very early critique of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? But I think that idea of being untimely is really, in some ways, that idea of being, forgotten or being relegated outside of history as a result of not conforming to what we easily think of as being, part of, a sort of normative, valued, desirable version of bourgeois life. But then it's also, I would say, a kind of refusal of that, right? To be untimely, I mean, in a sense, means you can't conform to that, right? You can never be the proper bourgeois liberal subject. And it's a kind of response to that, knowing that that's not an aspiration that could ever be fulfilled, that then leads to alternative ways of existing and behaving and living. And so in that sense, I think that, what we saw with, or what we're remembering or trying to recover with regard to Claudette Colvin has a lot to do with, what does an alternative response to the impossibility of being that proper liberal subject look like, and how do we make that part of our history?
And you focus on Black artists, cultural producers who are doing that work of imagining. And the favorite text that you take up in the book for me, of course, is Jewel Gomez's The Gilda Stories. This vampire, right, who lives for a couple of centuries, who challenges our notions of aging and age and time. Talk a little bit about your interest in the Gilda Stories as it applies to the work that you do in Black Age.
Yeah, I mean, the Gilda stories, I might have read it for the first time in your class, Mark. Come to think of it, in a sense, it's part of a piece. The vampire as a figure is interesting for a number of reasons, right? It's extractive. There's this question of consent involved with the vampire, right? The vampire feeds off of others, perhaps not consensually, but the question of consent is raised in the the Gilda stories.
Yep.
There's the way in which varying histories are brought together by virtue of these long lives. So the Lakota ancestry of Bird can be brought together with Gilda's story of enslavement, right? And so we have this Black and Indigenous solidarity project happening over a scale of time. And so, part of so those are things I'm certainly interested in the Gilda stories. But in addition to that, with regard to the idea of the vampire as such, there's this question about how Black figures do a kind of mediating work between the past and the present, right? So we as contemporary subjects don't have unmediated access to the past, right? Something,
right.
There has to be something that gives us a way into thinking about the past, right?
Access
We don't,
to it. Yep.
Right. And so, we may want to experience the past as unmediated, as if we can experience the immediacy of the past. And in some ways, maybe the neo-slave narratives as a genre, kind of give us that sense of immediacy. Like, what if we were there, right? I think that there's that kind of sense of immediacy that, to some degree, maybe intensified over the last several years, right? That idea of like, what if we were back in a time before rights, right? Like, what does it feel like to be in that? Perhaps because we've lived through an inflection point where time was made conspicuously untimely, right? We're free, but we're not free, right? And so I think that in some ways, that idea of wanting to experience the past as unmediated gets sort of explored with the figure of the vampire, who in some ways is not conspicuously elderly, but nonetheless has lived a very long life and can carry history in particular ways. So the way that the vampire as a kind of mediating presence between the past and the present, works is interesting to me, but also how that comes to bear in specific relationships in the present, right? So to have lived as, to some ways to be like a kind of figure of the historical past, and then to sort of negotiate with, other subjects, through these questions of consent, which are historical, right? When one was enslaved, the idea of consent is a very fraught one. You can't consent, but you can't not consent, right? In some ways, right? Like so in a sense, you're not a legal subject, but you are subject to, the obligations of law, right? As Saidiya Hartman has allowed us to see. So all of those historical complications with consent are brought to the present in the figure of the vampire in particular ways. And the contemporary subjects the vampire negotiates with also has to negotiate with that, right? So in a sense, I think that there's, a very interesting set of possibilities that particular figure and that particular novel allows us to explore. Like, could there be an ethics to this unequal balance of power that the vampire has with a human, right? In the Gilda stories, there's always this idea of exchange, right? You take some blood, you give something back, right? You give back a pleasant memory, you give back a pleasant thought, right? There has to be something you give if you're taking. And yet, that novel also invites us to ask whether that can ever be properly reciprocal, whether that's ever, entirely ethical. And so it's opening up not just a question that seems particular to the vampire narrative, but it's opening up a question of history, right? It's opening up a question of when is consent in some ways complicated in ways that we don't usually think about, right? So, I think that that's what the vampire is doing there. It's really asking us to think about our relationship to the historical past in unusual and different ways, and in ways that might then help us understand something else or something differently about the historical past.
What was, as you were researching this project and writing it, what was one of your aha moments? As in one of those moments where the research and your thinking made you kind of pause and go, I wouldn't have expected that. Or it challenged what your expectations were for something that you were writing about the project.
Oh, that is a very good, very, very good question. Because on the one hand, it's an unusual project insofar as once I was keyed into it, I was seeing untimely age everywhere, right? So it's just like, of course, right? Like, Black, age is never normative in any way. We're all wearing time differently, right? So like, it just became a kind of common sense that needed to be explained in some ways.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
on the other hand, there were moments, I guess, that didn't really, that may not seem particularly central to the book's arguments and its chapters, but just things that didn't maybe make it to the book in like a full way, I should say.
Yeah.
Just Michael Jackson. I mean, like, in a sense, I know you probably didn't expect me to say that, but like, because it's a literary book, I focus a lot on literary texts, but, of course, there's so many examples you can think of in terms of popular culture and mass culture.
Right.
And how long we thought about the fact that he didn't have a childhood, right? Like how that explanation for everything.
Yeah,
I mean, if you're of a certain generation, like you will remember that it became ideological, right?
Right.
Like everybody knows he didn't have a childhood. And I recall like we kind of accepted that.
Right.
And I guess the revelation in the writing of the book occurred through moments that returned to me like that.
Yeah.
Like, here's someone who, for all of his life, right, as a precocious child performer, was told that he, for all intents and purposes, has the talent of an adult, right? So he was constantly compared to adult men at the age of 9, right? At the age of 10, right? He's the, 9-year-old Jackie Wilson. He's the 9-year-old James Brown, right? Like, and he knew that he could perform adultness.
Right.
And, we get to a moment where, in a sense, I guess that's evidence of a lack of a childhood, but the entire way in which he was able to exploit a narrative about Black untimeliness became really interesting to me. It certainly is outside of the purview of the book, but just thinking about like, how do we not only find ourselves subjected to the logic of time, where we're out of time for varying reasons, right? We're not quite adult-ish, even when we're adults. Children aren't quite childish, even when they're children, right? We know the subjective power of it, but when do we exploit it, right? And not just reclaim something of it, but when do we manipulate it, and how do we manipulate it, right? And so those are, kinds of those questions were some that occurred to me in unexpected ways.
Yeah. We've been joined today by Professor Habiba Ibrahim, Associate Professor of English at the University of Washington. She's the author of Troubling the Family, The Promise of Personhood and the Rise of Multiculturalism, published in 2012, and the just published Black Age, Oceanic Lifespans and the Time of Black Life, published by New York University Press, of which Margot Natalie Crawford writes. This truly revelatory book uncovers the flesh of Black age through a focus on Black untimeliness. Habiba Ibrahim reveals a counter history of modernity. Thank you, as always, for joining us, Habiba. This is a wonderful book, and if I might hyper editorialize at this moment, I am quite proud of you for this tremendous work.
Oh, thank you so much, Mark, for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been an absolute honor. Thank you so much.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot.